Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
They say it's like the fall of Saigon. Now, I don't know if all of you are old enough to remember what it was like after the Vietnam War and American forces pulled out, but I remember seeing scenes of residents of Vietnam, people who allied with America, people who worked for America, running in on the airport tarmacs, trying to get into a helicopter, a plane, something to get them out before the communists, the North Vietnamese communists, came in. It was a tragic scene. Not everybody made it. A lot of not everybody's made it. And that's kind of what we're seeing today now with Afghanistan and the Taliban taking over. What's going to happen? That's the question. What's going to happen to those who are left behind? Remember, you've got diplomats there from overseas, Americans and Europeans, etc. You've got translators. You've got people who work for the diplomats. You've got the media, people who are journalists, who are, some of them could be trapped there. What is going to happen to these people? And also the Afghans themselves, who sided with the West, who were working, had jobs there, maybe had jobs at the embassies, etc. We know that there are translators and their families who have not been able to leave yet. There's a lot of questions that we have. And again, we're going to be asking how this can impact not just the region, but the entire geopolitical scene. We're going to be having a guest on today who's going to talk about that. He says it's like the fall of Saigon. Very, very disturbing. Also, Israel having a terrible, terrible fire in the Jerusalem Hills area. If you've seen pictures, it was just devastating. It took a long time until firefighters here in Israel were able to take control of the area of the fire. 6 different communities evacuated from their homes. They've now been able to return, thank God. I want to say hi to everybody who's listening from all over the world, from all over the United States, Canada, Israel, Italy, France, South Africa, Nigeria, Australia, etc., etc. Nice to see you here. Thanks for joining us. We'll be right back.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
It's like the fall of Saigon. That's what our guest Jerry Gordon says when it comes to Afghanistan today and what we're seeing, the images on the screen, on the news. Jerry Gordon is our guest. He's the senior editor at the New English Review. He was the producer and co-host of the former Israel News Talk Radio Beyond the Matrix program. He's also the author of The West Speaks and co-author of Genocide in Sudan, Caliphate Threatens Africa and the World. His significant articles cover a wide range of issues, including Islamic counterterrorism, military intelligence, military technology, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Muslim irredentism in China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. He served as a U.S. Army intelligence officer during the Vietnam War era, and he was a witness to the 9/11 attack in Manhattan. and he chronicled developments over the past 2 decades on America's pursuit of the Taliban. He's a graduate of Boston University and Columbia University with degrees in economics and finance. I want to welcome to the show Jerry Gordon.
Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you. Thank you for coming on the show. I know that you are the person to go to when it comes to what's going on in this region and what's happening with Afghanistan. We've been seeing news footage all over the news with people trying to get out, and we hear a lot of talking from the White House trying to talk down the accusations against the Biden administration for bungling the leave, their leaving of Afghanistan. So where would you like to start?
Well, let's start with the accusations of bungling and suggest that basically, look, there's been enough intelligence over the course of 2 decades to indicate that the Taliban was going to return at some point in time because of the rampant amount of corruption within what passed as the Republic of Afghanistan, and quite frankly, a lot of the bakshish transactions that were done. It was not uncommon for people to work with both the regime, the Republic itself during the winter months, and joined the Taliban during the summer.
Why?
Well, because, frankly, it resulted in more money for them. Let me give you some homely examples of this.
Please.
Through an informed source who was an American contractor in Afghanistan involved with security. And he dealt with the border police in many of the very same locations that have fallen to the Taliban during the past couple of months, and more dramatically this past week. And he spoke of an experience of being present in Herat, one of those cities that was taken over this past week. And he was at the border station going through customs. And there were 3 trucks, not just 2 trucks. It was a truck from Iran offloading food and other materials into a truck that would go basically elsewhere in Afghanistan. But there was a 3rd truck that the border police itself was offloading gear onto. And in fact, the commander of that border police station was pleased as punch to indicate that he had bribed essentially the national police for this spot so he could continue his quest of earning money. It was one example of that. The other example on the other part of Afghanistan, which fell, I believe, yesterday, was the customs station below Jalalabad, hard by the Pakistani border. That place was rife with cross-border traffic of people, funds, and goods. And what basically this means is that the Taliban now has essentially a new source of revenue, which are the tolls of these various customs stations. On top of that, it's had the legacy of the opium trade. I think there's one report that indicates that in 2019, the latest estimates were that they were creaming something like over $1 billion and a tad annually. And if they were doing that for, let's say, the last couple of decades, they really had a massive war chest. But let's sort of deal with the question of whether this was a massive intelligence failure on the part of the U.S. itself. People inside, I guess, the U.S. intelligence community would say no. They have been accurately warning about this for a while. But the real question is, the Taliban is a creature of essentially its next door neighbor, Pakistan. I don't know if many of your listeners realize that the Taliban was frankly formed well back in the 90s in a dispute with the Mujahideen, the fighters against the Soviet army during the decade between 1979 and 1989 when it left ignominiously. And these fighters in the Taliban essentially were all graduates of the radical madrasas inside Pakistan. They were also essentially supported by the so-called inter-service intelligence component of the Pakistani government. And the ISI cooperated with the CIA clandestinely. As you may recall, back in the 80s, a famous episode called Charlie Wilson's War, about the subterfuge of filtering weapons, including, I might add, weapons from stocks that the Israelis had captured in two wars, to essentially Pakistan, and supplied to the Mujahideen at that point in time.
Jerry, I want to ask you a question. I want to go back to the point where you said that a lot of the Afghani army was working. Yep. They were kind of like moonlighting, as you would put it. They were working part-time for the Afghanistan military, and then they would also be working with the Taliban. So my question is, first of all, number one, that might answer the question of why the Afghani military isn't really fighting back against the Taliban. They're just walking in the Taliban and taking over, basically, because the administration in Washington the Biden administration saying we left them with 300,000 men in their military. They had an air force, and they should have been able to, get these 75,000 fighters from the Taliban. That was their claim. And so that might answer the question. But also, who is giving the money to the Taliban? You see pictures of the Taliban. They don't have an air force. They don't have a proper army. You see them riding on motorcycles and bikes against the big, giant military that Afghanistan had, trained by the superpower America, and they couldn't beat them. Who is giving the Taliban money to pay these soldiers from the Afghani military and weakening their military?
I touched on one of the major sources. Don't forget that the Taliban is wedded in an ethnic group called the Pushtun. And the Pushtun were originally from the south and east, places like Kandahar, which is a major opium production center. And as I said earlier in the program, this has been going on for decades. And in fact, the U.S. had failed miserably to try and suggest to the farmers in that area that there were other, quote, profitable alternate crops to be planted instead of poppy seeds, essentially, in the area.
Okay, so let me interrupt you again. So you're saying that they got their money basically from the drug trade, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
But guess who facilitated the international drug trade for them? The Pakistanis.
Okay, but I remember seeing a news report showing American troops protecting the poppy farmers and the poppy farms to be able to keep going on. And they were saying that they were giving this order, and the American soldiers were upset about it, too. They didn't want to have to protect something like this, the drug trade. But they said, look, this is how the people make their living, and we have to keep letting them make a living. And that was the weak excuse. But I understand that the CIA was actually getting money and able to fund their programs and their whatever they had from the poppy seeds, that America was getting money from these poppy farms.
I don't know about that, but the answer is it's been clear to a lot of analysts that there's got to be a reason why you couldn't convince the Afghans to plant different crops that they could easily have done. The reason is that basically, again, it's bakshish. It's a bribe that they have been cultured on for well over, 1,400, 1,500 years for all intents and purposes. And they're a pretty resilient group of ethnic denominations, but there are also internal tribal conflicts even within those ethnic groups. But I think the one question you really have to pose is, how are they able to do this so rapidly? And when did we find out about it?
Okay, hold it right there. We have to go to a break. We'll be right back.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Steve Miller.
And I'm Matt Zucker.
Join us for Lighten Up, where we take a look at the week's current events in Israel and from around the Jewish world through a humorous lens.
If you've been paying attention during these crazy times, you know that it's a challenge to parody life anymore. But join Steve and I as we give it the old college try. Not only is being happy an obligation, but life is just too short to take it all so seriously.
So join me, Steve Miller.
And me, Matt Zucker.
For Lighten Up every Monday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Israel, only on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
All right, we're back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and we're talking about the fall of Afghanistan, many people likening it to the fall of Saigon, people trying to get out before they are forced to stay there with the Taliban in power. We're going to be finding out what might happen to these people who were left behind, what we can expect to see, what will happen after the Taliban take power, how the Biden administration is trying to explain their what many people are saying they're fumbling in the handling of this. And our guest is Jerry Gordon. He's the senior editor at the New English Review, and he's talking with us now about what is happening. So, Jerry, in the last segment, we were talking about how the Afghan military, and this is what the Secretary of Blinken was talking about, saying that, we didn't bungle anything up. We left them with a military of 300,000 soldiers, and they had an air force, and, this was not expected, what's happening. But you're saying that the Taliban has been waiting quietly and take it from there.
Well, basically, what the Taliban have been doing is, in plain sight, telling the world how they were going to take back the country. And one of the experts who's written about this, been interviewed about it recently, is Bill Raja. He's the editor of the Long War Journal at the Washington, D.C. Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And Bill pointed out that the Taliban maintains an English language website. It's called The Voice of Jihad. And basically, anybody who could access it and take a look at their content would realize essentially what they were doing out there. For all intents and purposes, what they were accomplishing was something extraordinary. They were co-opting what used to be the Northern Alliance, composed of the Mujahideen, which were their enemies. You may recall that 2 days before 9/11, there was a assassination of the leader of the Northern Alliance, called the Lion of the Panjshir Valley, Ahmed Massoud. And it was done with a phony camera team who was filming an interview with him and resulted in his killing. They were the enemy of the Taliban. They were the enemy of Al-Qaeda. And what happened during the last decade was the cultivation of the former enemy, the Mujahideen groups in the Northern Alliance. And it was done through a combination of bribery, and also pre-positioning and training and recruiting of these former mujahideens to essentially become the cadres in those areas. The other aspect of how successful the Taliban was the fact that it did it from the rural areas to close on the provinces and the major cities. The U.S. military, according to Roggio's analysis, had developed a strategy to concentrate on the cities. And as a result of it, it grew in the countryside to the point where it could actually engage in rapid takeover of these provinces. I think within the last week, something like a quarter of the provinces fell to them before they were able to infiltrate today, which is yesterday, Sunday, into Kabul itself. So this is not something that the intelligence community did not know. Mm-hmm. Ruggio seems to feel it is a catastrophic failure of military doctrine and intelligence.
Okay, so Jerry, I want to ask, I have a lot of questions, and if you can, I'd like to ask you to answer in bullet points because there's so much to go through. So Blinken yesterday, when I was watching his interview, was saying that America was there for around 20 years and it was unable to beat the Taliban. So my question to you, and I'm sure our listeners are questioning this as well, is how is it that the superpower with Air Force, with one of the best military trainers, training, etc., was not able to beat in 20 years the Taliban?
Well, very simply, the Taliban had the people, and it bribed them, and it cultivated them in terms of their doctrine, and it defeated essentially the ability of the superpower to create a, quote, democratic, freedom-loving country. It's impossible.
All right. So again, where did they get their money from? Because we see them, they don't look like any type of polished military. They're riding on a bunch of motorcycles that are not new, not like, the Harley Davidsons. They look like a dusty, ragtag bunch of, poor terrorists coming together. Where did they get the money again to be able to bribe people?
A goodly chunk of it came out of the drug trade, the opium trade.
And the Americans couldn't stop? I mean, couldn't they just have burned the fields down? Couldn't they have just? I'm not saying that they should do this. I'm just thinking, if I were a ruthless person, I didn't care about life, I would have the farmers killed. If I had to, you can say, well, it's part of military. They're funding a Taliban, and we told them not to do it, and so now they get the death penalty. I mean, I don't understand.
They failed. The U.S. failed to essentially provide alternates for agricultural production for poppies, and in fact, the answer is that the international drug trade, probably facilitated through their neighbors in Pakistan, bribed them to continue the production.
So why couldn't America, with all of its money, bribe them even higher and say, don't grow it? I mean, America does it to its own farmers, saying, don't grow your potatoes, don't grow your corn, we're going to give you money instead. Why? I don't understand.
Well, the U.S. failed to do that.
Why?
And
do you think it's just stupidity that they're dumb? Or I'm a housewife. How is it that I can think of ways that the American, I see what goes on, the evil stuff and the business stuff, if the business doesn't work, if the incentives don't work, the carrot and the stick, then you go in and you burn the fields down, you make it so that farmers are not going to want to do it, or you take out the farmers if they're doing something like this to fund the Taliban, which are an evil bunch of people.
I think the Americans felt they were a guest in the country, let's put it that way, and that
I don't buy that. I don't buy it. You really think that Americans, out of politeness, well, we're guests here, so we can't. Come on, I mean, you're talking about the strongest military in the world going in. They're in there because they have an incentive to be there, and yet in 20 years they can't take out a bunch of people who don't have an Air Force, don't have a Navy, don't have special weaponry that the United States has. I just don't understand it unless they wanted the Taliban to win. That there's a different reason, because it seems to me that if you want to get rid of their funding, which is one of the first things that you would do with your enemy, you take out the source of where they're getting their money from.
They failed to do that. That's the simple answer.
And you don't know why they failed to do that in 20 years. When a housewife like I, who happens to have a radio show, can think of burn them out, get rid of the farmers, or I mean that's after you try to bribe them and show them, listen, give them good incentives. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. Okay, let's move on. The Taliban is in power now. What do you think is going to happen to all of the people who are stuck there, who couldn't get out?
Well, it's not going to be a pretty scene for them. Many of those people who were deemed to be allies of America, of the U.S., are probably fair game for Sharia-like punishment, which obviously means they can be executed. You may recall, if you're old enough, these horrible pictures of assassinations of persons in sports stadiums. Remember, sports was outlawed underneath the regime of Taliban 1.0 back in the 90s. And you found women dressed in these
sacks,
blue, essentially, who were shot to death. So you're going to find a lot of that. One comment I can make was there was a film clip I saw yesterday of an actual interview with the Taliban in one of the captured communities, and they made it abundantly clear to everyone that no girls were going to be educated beyond the age of 12, period.
Right.
And therefore, parents persisted in that direction. They're probably fair game for being executed.
Terrible. I remember yesterday somebody tweeted that they were going to university in Afghanistan. It was a woman, and she was barred from going into the university. This already happened yesterday. This tweet came up, and they don't know if and when they'll be able to go back to university. All right, the music is coming on now for telling us that we have a break. We're going to be right back after the news, and we're going to be asking more questions about what will happen now? What will the reprisals be? And what will be the future of the region? We'll be right back.
Thanks.
Are you tired of political correctness and the fear that you might offend someone?
I'm not afraid to offend you.
Wow, look who's talking tough.
One has to be tough to keep sane today.
Hi, I'm Alan Skorsky.
And I'm Beulah Seabrow.
And join us every Wednesday for The Definitive Wrap as we interview the most sought-after guests and expose progressive trends that masquerade as enlightenment but actually destroy our freedoms.
We are the No Woke Zone, so buckle up to this exciting show.
Buckling up, but I'm driving.
Sure, you can drive, but I'm the navigator.
Tune in for the No Nonsense, The Definitive Wrap Show, every Wednesday on Israel News Talk Radio.
We are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. We're talking about Afghanistan and the Taliban's taking over. Yesterday, on Sunday, you saw pictures of Taliban fighters in the office of the presidential palace in Kabul. And it is frightening to think what is going to happen to those allies of America and the West who are left behind, translators, possibly journalists if they haven't gotten out yet, families of workers of the embassies, etc. What is going to happen to these people? Our guest is Jerry Gordon. He's a senior editor at the New English Review, and he is talking to us about what is going on in Afghanistan and how it may affect us. So, Jerry, let me just ask you again some more questions, and if you can answer in bullet points, and just answer for our listeners very briefly. Why do you believe that the left-wing Biden administration wanted out of Afghanistan after 20 years of American forces being there, keeping the Taliban out? What made them want to leave?
I think it's because Joe Biden in particular, even when he was part of the Obama administration, felt, look, there are a number of what he considered as voting middle-class worker people who were getting killed over there, and that he wanted the conflict to end. And quite frankly, we had been bleeding out money and other resources. I mean, it cost us something in excess of $88 billion to, quote, train, equip, and advise 300,000 troops who disappeared in the case of the last couple of weeks and months, supposedly. Okay. And I think that's the reason why Biden said, look, enough in that regard.
Okay, so I would counter with a question saying that the United States and every country that has troops in another country isn't there in order to protect the people. They're there because there's interest in being there. There's some type of payoff. And otherwise, America wouldn't be in there for 20 years, wouldn't be spending all that money, wouldn't be taking the chance of some of their soldiers being picked off. Why were they there in the first place? I mean, after they got bin Laden, what is the reason that they had an interest in still being there?
Their interest was in being there was the fact that it was the base for our friend, the late bin Laden, to conduct his attack on something that I looked at 20 years ago on 9/11 in New York and elsewhere, and even before that. In East Africa, for example, and against the USS Cole, and I could run down the whole gamut of stuff. So that was one reason. And in fact, the Bush administration was infuriated by the fact when they asked the Taliban to surrender bin Laden, they said, no, the Islamic standard of hospitality covers him. And hence they decided to go in there. We actually, as you may recall, won the war against the Taliban in less than 2 months in the tail end of 2001. And so therefore you have to ask, how were we stalled in there over 2 decades trying to run a sophisticated counterinsurgency program that didn't work?
Or it could also be maybe their interest, if true, that the Americans were getting money also from the drug trade over there themselves. But I don't know. Okay, we'll just leave it at that. One of the problems with their hightailing it out of there, the Americans, is, I mean, when I say hightailing, I mean, if people don't have time to leave, that's hightailing it out. That they're going to have mistrust from their allies or anybody who's thinking of allying with the United States. They will see that, on the record, they cannot be trusted for having their back. So why would anyone want to ally with the United States when they see that America could just hightail it out of their country and leave them to pick up the pieces?
You're right. And let me give you some examples. Remember Georgia? It was attacked by Russia in 2008.
Yes.
And you had the episode with Putin's Russia taking over a province from the Ukraine.
Yes.
Way back in, 2014? And even making, quote, war against a political region of the Ukraine.
The Crimea was, right?
It's over. Right. And then the U.S. came up with a recognition of so-called non-NATO allies. And 9 years ago, they listed Afghanistan as a valued non-NATO ally. That and 25 cents will get you somewhere. It didn't. And so therefore, the U.S. does not have a very good track record in dealing with allies who are not up to the standards, for example, of being members of NATO and therefore subject to Charter 5, which says you are attacked. If you are attacked, as the U.S. was on 9/11, essentially, then the NATO partners were honor bound to come to your assistance to deal with guess who? The Taliban and Al-Qaeda in essentially Afghanistan. And that was the history of that involvement. And so therefore, the U.S. does not have a very good track record in the context of honoring so-called commitments to these non-NATO allies.
All right, so let's go back now and just review very briefly. With the Taliban taking over, you're saying that there will be reprisals. People are going to be killed. I assume that a lot of people are going to be losing their property and their businesses if they sided with America and or they're not part of the Taliban. Women cannot go to universities. Women cannot get an education after age 12, at least you said. What else? What else can we expect to see?
Well, the women are going to have to go back to wearing the niqabs. That's the one that has slits for eyes, and that's about the extent of it. And that, unfortunately, what has been going on in some of these areas is that girls as young as 12 are being forced to marry the fighters. What does that sound like? Mm-hmm. Sounds like ISIS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. And all right, this is just so sad for the Afghani people. My heart goes out to them. Will there be slavery?
Yes, there will be slavery.
In a sentence or two, explain how.
Well, simply imposing burdens on children and some women to basically surface the fighters, and also essentially to prepare food and function as personal slaves.
And sorry, go ahead.
That will occur.
And also now, how is this going to affect the rest of the region and the world? What does it mean for somebody living in Tennessee, or someone living in Paris, or someone living in Melbourne? What does it mean?
Well, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Milley, had said yesterday that basically the fall of Afghanistan means the rise of global terrorism. It provides a safe haven for it. Well, let me be a little bit of a critic of that.
Okay, we only have like another minute and a half left to the show. Go ahead.
Okay. Think about where ISIS and Al-Qaeda are very active today. It's an area that I've written about. That's the Sahel region. That's below the Sahara Desert in Africa. You've seen it in Nigeria, Niger, Mali, and other locations, including Madagascar. And it's caused havoc. And so therefore the question is, Al-Qaeda has moved on to other targets across the globe. It doesn't need a sanctuary in Tora Bora or whatever those mountains were in the Hindu-Kush at this point. So the question is, what is going to happen in this area? The one thing the Pakistanis really fear is that because the Taliban may be victorious, as one of their analysts said, but they don't know how to run a country.
Okay, and really quick, because we only have like 30 seconds left, how is this going to affect everybody else around the world in a sentence or two?
In a sentence or two, it will basically tell them that political Islam and Sharia are alive and well and deadly.
Wow, that is scary. And growing. I mean, if they can, I mean, they essentially beat the superpower of the world, the United States of America.
Correctamundo.
This is very, very frightening, very concerning. It should concern everyone because they're emboldened by this. It's not even just a physical winning, but their spirits are up now. They feel that they've had this win, and it'll encourage them even more, which makes them even more dangerous. All right, I want to thank you so much, Jerry Gordon, for coming on the show and talking to us about the modern fall of Saigon happening in Afghanistan. We pray for the people there, and I want to thank you again, Jerry, for coming on and telling us about all the background information that we need to understand. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you, everybody. If you have any comments or questions, you can write me, Tamar, Tamar, at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.